So thank you all. It's good to be here. Can you hear me okay? Good. Okay. I'm going to be talking about multi-faith America. Religious America is a multi-faith place. And there are three big things I'm going to do in the next 30 to 40 minutes. Then we'll do some Q&A. One is going to be history. We need to know a little bit about the history of how we got here as a society that is not all of one religion, and in fact has always been multi-faith or a multi-religious society. The second thing we need to know is about some of the sociological factors that influence how we think about being a multi-faith society. And in this regard, I think I may say some things that surprise you. So there's some parts of our history that we're not aware of, but that deeply play into the kinds of attitudes we have and the geographical distribution of those attitudes. Then the last thing I'm going to talk about is some statistical things that relate to both what is the current status of multiple religions in the United States and what are the changing attitudes of Americans toward the fact that we live in a multi-faith society and toward specific religions. And that will give us then a kind of a background to think about where we are, where we're located, and how we relate to each other at a national level. Greg is going to talk much more about Houston. And which is important, by the way, because as I will say at the very end of my talk, large growing urban areas are significantly different than non-growing urban areas, and they're significantly different than rural areas, both in terms of content and attitude. So being in Houston is being in a unique place, or Dallas for that matter. But Dallas and Houston are somewhat different than Austin and San Antonio, just to stay in the state of Texas. So, origins. Where did we get started? Well, the continent named America by the earliest European explorers has, of course, been inhabited for 15,000 years before they arrived. So they didn't bring religion. The indigenous American peoples had a wide diversity of religions, although their beliefs and practices weren't easily recognized by European settlers. European settlers in the United States had a pretty fixed idea of what a religion should look like. And if your religion didn't look like that, then they didn't identify it as a religion. I'll stop here with a brief factoid for you. The term religion, Religion in German, 500 years ago meant Roman Catholicism. It was not used for any other phenomenon. It wasn't used for Islam. It wasn't used for Judaism. Religion meant Roman Catholicism. And I lived in Austria for 7 years, and that wasn't that many years ago. And even there, in common usage, people would refer to Methodists, Baptists, Pentecostals, Muslims, Buddhists, and Hindus as members of sects. Only Roman Catholicism was religion, right? Now, that changed, broadly speaking. Austrians are very conservative in this matter. We began to apply religion to other things, but it wasn't easy to see that some of these things were religion if your framework was it must look Catholic. Does that make sense? Okay. In any case, Europeans almost uniformly believed that the reason for coming into the New World, aside from commerce, was conversion, that the indigenous people needed to be made into Protestant or Catholic Christians, but in the earliest days mostly Catholic, later Protestants would come. Now, what about religious freedom? Europeans began permanent settlements in what is now the United States for two broad reasons. One, to pursue commercial interests, and this was really the biggest reason for most of them. However, another reason, and this is highlighted in our popular history, is to escape religious persecution. Sometimes ethnic, but usually religious persecution. So the latter groups that are coming to escape religious persecution include the Puritans of Massachusetts. We all know their story, the Pilgrim story, right? The Catholics of Maryland, because England would lurch through anti-Catholic sentiments, so the colony of Maryland was set up as a Catholic refuge from Catholic persecution in England. They wanted to establish their own religious freedom, but I think what's notable in both Maryland and Massachusetts is they had no intention of establishing religious freedom for anybody else. Okay? And my family has a bit of a history here. Our oldest American ancestor was named Jacob Hunt. He arrived in the Massachusetts Bay Colony in the early 17th century when it was barely established. and he was promptly kicked out for being a free thinker. And you'll remember those early Massachusetts Puritans killed people that didn't conform to Puritan Christianity. They killed Quakers, not just witches. They killed Quakers, and they killed Catholics. So they came to establish religious freedom for themselves. My earliest ancestor therefore moved to Pennsylvania, which interestingly was established on the basis of religious freedom for all. So Roger Penn, so it's two different colonies that are right next to each other, Massachusetts and Pennsylvania. One, religious freedom for us. One, religious freedom for everybody. I think my earliest ancestor was disappointed. His wife passed away, and he was forced to send his children to be raised by an aunt in Rhode Island who was a Quaker, and so they were all raised Quakers, not free thinkers like he was, whatever that word meant. And we were all Quakers until my grandfather wandered into a Methodist meeting up on the high plains near Estacado, Texas. And apparently, if the stories are true, realized that there was a form of being religious that did not involve sitting quietly for 2 hours and waiting for some old fart to get the spirit and talk while you were segregated male and female. He saw people shouting, singing, eating chicken, and boys and girls sat together, and he said, "Whoa, I am saved." And he became a Methodist, and we've all been Methodists ever since, and we've got bishops in the family and that sort of thing too. So it apparently took, but by the way, we had a bit of experience as a family then. How did a Quaker family end up in Estacado, Texas, up near Dumas? Well, because Quakers weren't welcome. Whenever the United States was at war, Quakers who refused to fight weren't welcome. And so they migrated across the middle part of the United States, escaping religious persecution until they ended up in the desert. So that's kind of the history. So Pennsylvania, Rhode Island, these are colonies set up for religious freedom. European groups, therefore, especially Quakers and Jews, but also Continental Lutherans, Anabaptists, and others, could get away from religious persecution in Europe and find freedom in the American colonies, as long as they came to Rhode Island and Pennsylvania. The other colonies were Anglican. They had a state religion. Now, they weren't as averse to religious diversity as Massachusetts and Maryland were, but you were still under the crown. So in the century before the American Revolution, the original colonies, if we take all of them together, were religiously diverse, and they represented all of Europe's Christian groups, as well as Jews, as well as indigenous Americans who still lived on the western side of those colonies. But within each colony, they might not be so diverse, right? The United States, what would be the proto-United States, had become a diverse society, but the diversity was in pockets of where diversity was allowed. Now, the Europeans were not the only migrants into the colonies, although our official histories tend to focus on Europeans. There were also a substantial slave population. The slave population in the southern colonies had been captured from sub-Saharan West Africa, and they brought with them the religion of their home countries. Often morphed, by the way. I think where many of us are not aware that historically the majority of West African slaves came through the Caribbean. So the biggest slave markets were not direct to Africa, to the colony, southern colonies. They were Africa to Havana. And then from Havana onward, and there's slave forts on the western coast or the northern coast of all of Cuba, where these slaves came in. So they had already made a journey, a horrifying journey, but they brought with them their religions. Now those religions, the indigenous religions of the Yoruba, the Igbo, the Akan, the Gan, and the other groups of West Africa, those indigenous religions were mostly going to be suppressed within the plantations where they worked as slaves, and they would only be remembered in certain aspects of African American popular Christianity. So as the slaves became Christianized, aspects of their older religious traditions remained. However, there was another religion that the West African slaves brought, and that was Islam. And there's ample evidence that many of the slaves were Muslim when they arrived, and that we have actually written in excellent evidence of an entire Muslim community within the context of a plantation that survived up until the Civil War. It had its own Bilal, it had its own Imam, and they basically, it was a place where it happened that a large number of Africans of Muslim descent were in the same place under a qualified religious leader, and so the community was able to endure secretly in this context. Okay, but we should be aware that, so the inheritance was not only the indigenous religions of West Africa from which the slaves came, but also Islam. And there's some fascinating work on how much Islamic musical ideas morphed through even Christianity and into modern hip-hop and rap. So it's worth checking out. But there are definitely relationships between the West African schools of Islamic chanting and contemporary hip-hop rhythms. So turns out our history is more complicated than we thought it was, right? And sometimes these diverse influences exist in ways that we didn't think of them. Like the fact that I still sometimes wake up in the morning and wish I was quiet for 2 hours where men and women sat separately. That, you know, it doesn't happen often, but, you know, sometimes. So religious diversity becomes a reality and an ideal. The situation in the American colonies at the time of the Revolution. Religious diversity overall, religiously homogeneous and often mutually antagonistic individual colonies. The Puritans didn't care for the Catholics. Probably the same is true in reverse. Okay? One of the things that we as American Protestants have to realize is that we do inherit out of our English roots and out of our Lutheran roots and Germanic roots a deep anti-Catholicism that was always part of the European scene in those days. Right? And it comes into the American colonies via Europe, and it pops up in different and diverse ways. And some of us, if we think about either ourselves or even our grandparents or parents and the things they said when we were growing up, might detect a hint of that, right? The problem then becomes for these American colonies, how do they achieve unity at the time of the War of Independence, okay? And especially when, remember, some of these colonies are built specifically about religious difference or embracing it. And then other colonies, particularly in the South, are crown colonies, so they're officially Anglican. They're officially the state religion of England. Okay? So how do you get them to unify? And the way it occurs, and it's fascinating to read the things, but in a sense, to begin to exclude religion from the discussions that were taking place around how to maintain a war against England. And in fact, the first time that the Continental Congress met to begin to formulate a Declaration of Independence and then a Constitution, the very first debate was, will we have a prayer to open? And the reason there was a debate was that people like Thomas Jefferson said, well, which of the 15 sectarian Christian groups represented here would get to say the prayer? Right? By the way, an enduring problem of interfaith relations. Are we going to have 100 prayers? So, in the end, they did, by the way, have a prayer. And the U.S. Congress ends up with having a chaplain. But it was a debate. So, at a formal level, the way in which they managed this unity was to put what is the First Amendment to the Constitution, which is that the federal government will establish no religion. In other words, what we typically call today the separation of church and state. We'll keep the federal government, the one we're agreeing on that's going to run this war, out of the religious business. The second thing would be the promise of religious freedom across the newly United States. So the concept of religious freedom that was found in Pennsylvania and Rhode Island would be extended across all of the colonies by federal mandate, right? They would all agree to that. That wasn't as hard as it seems, because by 1770 or even the mid-18th century, almost all of the colonies for economic reasons had become religiously diverse. At that time in history, Boston probably had more Catholics than Puritans, right? So if you wanted your city to grow, you couldn't just keep restricting it to one group. So religious diversity was real, and it led to this idea of religious freedom, okay? And so religious diversity is written into law. For some, it's just a way to get along. For some, it is an ideal. So a small factoid I discovered, I'm sponsoring a conference on religious freedom in October, and the people who are my co-sponsors have been feeding me information and courses and stuff. So here's a small factoid. The U.S. Constitution only establishes separation of church and state at a federal level. Many of the southern colonies maintain an official state church for decades. The Virginia colony was Anglican. Anglicanism was the official state church of Virginia because the U.S. Constitution doesn't say you can't do that. Now, for practical reasons, by the time of the Civil War, all of the state-sponsored religions had disappeared. The states just wanted to get out of that business, right? I mean, after all, if you're a government, do you really want to support a bunch of religious institutions that always ask for money? And by the way, then you've got other religious institutions coming in and go, why do you only give money to the Anglicans? Why don't you give money to the Methodists? Why don't you give money to the Baptists? You get the idea. So at a practical level, at a state level, the sponsorship of religion had disappeared. In the modern era, in the 20th century, it disappears altogether because so much federal funding is involved in government at every level. And all federal funding can't have any ties to religion. So just as a practical matter, we begin to have Supreme Court rulings that exclude established religion all the way down to school districts, et cetera. But it took 150 years, right? So, if I can sort of pause here for a second, I want us to realize the complex sociological inheritance we have. And that inheritance is, on one hand, religious freedom and diversity as an ideal. On the other hand, religious freedom and diversity as a pragmatic reality that you just have to cope with. On one hand, the establishment of freedom of religion and separation of church and state as a pragmatic matter of how can we all get along together, be united while we're having to fight the British. On the other hand, sometimes as an ideal, as something that's actually good. Not that we have to work with it, it's something we would like to have more of. And both of those strains, the pragmatism and the idealism, run right through American society, I think, up until today. They are two parts of our culture, and we find them in different places, right? And sometimes, as you know, in the contemporary era, they contest with each other, right? Idealists are promoting something that the pragmatists say, yeah, we have exactly enough of that. We can work with it, but we don't want any more. And the idealists are going, no, it's a good thing. That's like me. I love it. Okay, so how do we get then from the American Revolution to our present diversity? The late 19th century is a period of intense migration into the United States, primarily for economic reasons, and on both sides. There are people who are unemployed and underemployed, primarily in Europe, but also in parts of the Middle East and other places that we're in contact with, China, for example. And the United States economy is growing rapidly and needs workers. And so the United States becomes a very open place for workers to come to, and we have large waves of in-migration. We need workers, they got workers. It's that simple. And so who comes in that's going to change the demographic landscape? Well, first of all, a lot of Eastern and Southern Europeans and Irish who are Catholic or Greek Orthodox. 1860, 1870, the United States was a Protestant country. Catholics were a small minority. But now we have a large in-migration of Catholics from Southern Europe and Ireland and from Eastern Europe, Poland, but then we have also Greek Orthodox and others migrating in. Eastern European Jews escaping oppression from the Russian Empire began to migrate into the United States in fairly large numbers. So we begin to have a significant Jewish population. There had always been a Jewish population. The Jews that were engaged in the United States in the early days of colonialism were often traders. They had strong associations with Recife in Brazil, with Amsterdam, with parts of Portugal, and were engaged in the rum trade and other things. So places where there were seacoast towns, Charlotte, etc., or trading towns, there were Jewish populations. New York preeminently, of course, but elsewhere on the eastern seaboard. Now we have large migrations of Eastern European Jews who are not this older Jewish population, but are newer Jewish population coming, escaping profession. Turkish Muslims escaping the chaos of the breakdown of the Ottoman Empire. We say Turkish, they're often called Turkish, but some of them would have been what we call Arabs. They're not necessarily ethnic Turks, but the Ottoman Empire dominated the Arab world, right? So if you were coming from Syria or Lebanon or someplace like this, and you were a Muslim, you might be labeled a Turk, even though you weren't Turkish ethnically. In the same way that in Europe, oftentimes Muslims are called Moroccans, even though they're not ethnically Moroccans. But there was a long history with Morocco, and Muslim, must be Moroccan. You get the idea. So diverse Muslims and Hindus from the Middle East and the subcontinent coming as traders and merchants. We don't have widespread migration at this time, but the world is opening up. The Suez Canal opens up. People who are engaged in world trade, which included many Hindu and Muslim traders from the subcontinent, what is now Pakistan and India, are going to become active in that trade, and they will settle again in coastal seaport towns, both on the west and east coasts of the United States. The continued migration to and from dominantly Catholic Mexico, right? There's continual traffic back and across U.S. southern border in this period of time. Some of it is truly migrant. People move up, people move down. Some people move and they settle. And they form the Latino populations of Southern California and all of the southwestern states, including Texas. Migration out of the Caribbean and South America of Muslims, Hindus, and Jews. Now, this may be another one we're not too aware of, but it's important. Muslims, Hindus, and Jews had migrated into the Caribbean also because these were centers of trade, especially the production of rum and trade in slaves. And so those Caribbean populations also are going to migrate up into the United States when the economic times are good. And there's a little evidence of this in my own neighborhood. There's a small Hindu temple, mandir, and it's entirely made up of West Indian Hindus. They are at least 4 generations out of India that had been in the Caribbean, and now they've migrated into the United States. And you can understand that for cultural reasons, they don't blend well with the Hindu temple of people 1 and 2 generations out of India. And I believe one of our guests is out of Fiji, another huge Hindu-Indian colony down in the South Pacific. Half the population of Fiji is Hindu of Indian descent. So very interesting, right? Very interesting. Then finally, the Chinese migration to the West Coast, primarily to work on the railroads, but in the gold fields and elsewhere, that establishes an extremely large Asian population on the West Coast, and they are Buddhists, Taoists, and Confucians. So that's how in the late 19th century we begin to have the kind of migrations that are going to establish religious diversity, and I want to say on the coasts, right? Because that's where everybody settles when they come. Not so much of it in Texas. Houston is just barely getting going at this time. Galveston would have been the big migration town, but you know, Galveston had a huge Italian Catholic population for a long time, maybe still does. Corpus Christi had a very diverse population for a very long time, but our inner cities in Texas didn't see so much of this. They didn't meet that migration firsthand. So what about our present diversity? Well, the U.S. engagement in foreign wars, beginning with the Spanish-American War, the late 19th century, following World War I and World War II, followed by the Korean and the Vietnam Wars, are going to bring us to new ties with the world outside and new groups by migration and in migration and by marriage. Okay? Filipinos begin to come in large numbers to the U.S. after the U.S. essentially colonizes the Philippines, but also because a very large number of Filipino men fought in the U.S. armed services, both in World War I and World War II. And they would be in camps in the U.S. and they would eventually stay here. Marriage, of course. The U.S. servicemen married Japanese, they married Koreans, they married Vietnamese, they brought them back. We had waves of migration out of Vietnam, as you know, on the southern coast of Texas, sometimes with great controversy and conflict. So all of those, our foreign war engagements brought new forms of in-migration to us. And of course, by the way, Americans, GIs, married European women. And you wouldn't have to look very hard to find the children of those marriages probably within a mile of here. Plenty of people whose mother was German or Dutch or British or Norwegian or Scandinavian. All of that began to affect our thing. In fact, it gave us a way of thinking, and it's, how we think about ourselves as a migrant community is always interesting. So my parents, my grandparents, conservative West Texans, all of them, after they became Methodists. They were probably conservative before. I'll have to apologize if I do anything politically incorrect. I was out of the country when conservative Texans went from being conservative Democrats to becoming conservative Republicans. So I missed the whole social transition there during the Reagan years, and I've never actually caught up with it, to be honest with you. So, but I need to work on that. I'm trying to get back to my native accent too, but I lost it a lot while I was overseas. My wife and I had big discussions politically in the time of George Bush Jr. Because she was raised by British missionaries and missionaries who spoke British English, and she goes, "He's the most ignorant sounding man." And I go, "He sounds like my dad and all my uncles. I'm sorry." And my dad had a PhD. It's just the way we talk here. It's nothing to do with knowledge. Okay, but we develop different attitudes, social attitudes. And those attitudes, by the way, help us manage diversity. So my wife is ethnic Chinese from Malaysia. Her parents migrated from China to Malaysia. Okay, she's now a U.S. citizen. But my mom knew her and was cool with that. But I wondered about my West Texas uncles and aunts. I'm marrying a Chinese girl. And they had no problem. I took her out to meet Uncle RJ and Uncle Lance, Uncle Anthony and Aunt Jean and all this. And they kind of go, and then they go, "Yeah, but a lot of U.S. boys brought back wives from Asia." They still remember World War II. A lot of men brought back Japanese wives and Chinese wives. And so our engagement in the 20th century had given my parents' generation a way of negotiating diversity, right? Of imagining that you might have intermarriage because they'd seen it happen for a generation. We're used to it. I will be very honest. For that generation of my uncles and aunts, it probably would not have been problematic if she was Latino. A lot of Anglo men married a lot of Latino women. If she'd been African American, I think they might not have worked so well. Just to be honest, I know those people pretty well. That was not part of their social imaginary. Okay. Now, the second thing that happens is the U.S. Immigration Act of 1965, the last time the U.S. Congress passed comprehensive immigration legislation, 1965. It remains the seminal piece of immigration legislation because it is what controls our immigration now, okay? And it had a profound effect on this migration because it ended the discrimination against non-Europeans that was part of U.S. migration law. U.S. immigration law of 1924 had been set up to specifically keep Asians from entering the U.S. It was intended to put a stop to Chinese migration and to allow only European migration. That ends in 1965, and so non-Europeans, especially in this case, it's going to be people from the Indian subcontinent, Arabs from the Middle East, and Asians in general, are able now to migrate into the U.S. under sets of circumstances that are controlled, okay? And they're mostly economic. That is to say, almost anybody can migrate to the United States who has a professional degree and a job offer. And by the Immigration Act of 1965, they can bring their families with them. So, that Immigration Act both opens the way for a new wave of migration and a very different type of migration than in the past, okay? And at the same time that this is happening, we have changes in the U.S. economy that make migration both possible and necessary. There's a huge demand for educated workers, especially in the medical professions and engineers from 1965 onward in the U.S. economy. And that just grows as the tech industries grow. And because the Middle East the subcontinent of India, now Pakistan and India divided after the war, and Asia, but particularly China and Taiwan, because they are producing large numbers of qualified engineers and doctors who can readily find employment. You then begin to have increasing in-migration. And that's not going to be just in the coasts, that's going to be everywhere that these industries are set up. The old joke in Richardson, Texas, when I was a teenager, where E-Systems and others were rapidly growing. North American Rockwell bought out E-Systems, I forget all of them, Collins Radio, but Texas Instruments especially, and then in a host of other high-tech places that were developing chips and stuff. So the joke was that over in North Richardson, if a street sign fell off a strip mall in North Richardson, it would kill 5 graduates of the Taiwan University. Okay, the dramatic changes that brought to Richardson, Texas, I lived through and watched. And I'm simply going to note them now so you get an idea. When I was a teenager in Richardson, Texas, it called itself a city of churches. I went to First Methodist Richardson. At that time, it had 7,000 members. The Baptists were almost as big. Okay? It was a city of churches. I didn't know anybody that didn't go to church. The only thing that was small was the Catholic Church. And it was pretty big. They had 8 masses on Sunday. I mean, they would have been bigger. They just didn't have enough priests. So it was a city of churches. I went away for 20 years and I came back and I find that Richardson has 3 mosques, each of which serves more than 2,000 people, one of which serves more than 5,000 people. By my count, there are 9 Buddhist temples. And First Methodist Richardson's building, which was huge, was bought by a Buddhist association when it moved to a new building on the highway. The church I worshiped in is a meditation hall for Buddhists, of a large Buddhist association. Okay? It happens to be the largest building. It's probably not the biggest association. There are 3 Hindu temples in the city limits. There are 2 Sikh gurdwaras, and who knows the ones I haven't cataloged. Richardson, which had trouble in my time when I was in 8th and 9th grade, integrating its African American and Anglo populations in the school district. Now the school district speaks 70 different languages. That's a phenomenal change from when I graduated from high school in 1974 and today. And that change is taking place in a lot of places. It intensified in Richardson because of the high-tech industry, right, that brought in not merely Asian immigrants, Chinese dominantly, but also brought in lots and lots of Indian engineers, electronic engineers, engineers coming out of the Middle East, right? At the same time that the U.S. wanted highly qualified engineers, 2 things were happening. In the Middle East, India, and Asia, new schools of engineering were developing very rapidly to create those qualified people. And Anglo-American students were losing an interest in engineering. And it's a fascinating thing to watch. I sit every year at commencement at SMU, Priscilla's been there, is to look down the list of names of people graduating from the Lyle School of Engineering. One particular year, every single name was either Arabic or Indian. 112 graduates, not a single Smith, Barnes, Brown. Okay, so those things went together, and then finally, the little tip of this cake is, it's a small part, there begins to be conversion from Christianity to non-Christian religions. The biggest and most significant part of that is the conversion of African Americans to Islam. Now, I don't mean the Nation of Islam, which is it's its own kind of thing, but Malcolm X converts from Nation of Islam to Sunni Islam, classical Sunni Islam. That conversion before he dies is going to have a profound effect on parts of the African American community that will find Sunni Islam attractive, that is to say Orthodox conventional Islam attractive, and you're going to begin to see in certain areas, Atlanta, probably Houston, I don't know, but certainly Atlanta, up on the eastern seaboard, and on the west coast, you're going to see African Americans attracted into the Sunni Muslim community. Now, it's not a vast migration, don't get me wrong, the statistics are often overplayed, but it's significant. It's significant. Okay. So that's our present diversity. So I'm going to wrap up and we'll do questions. Where are we today in the United States? This is the latest Pew Charitable Trust's poll. which you can't even see. That's okay, this is the first one that was interesting anyway. Everything else was text.
Oh, you stole mine. It's okay.
Yeah, we're going to come back to it anyway. So forget the poll on the left. That's just where we were broken out at. Did you do this one, how things are changing?
No.
Oh, right, okay, so let's talk about this. This is a fascinating chart that Pew has done on how attitudes about religion are changing among different demographic groups. So on the far left-hand side of your screen, yeah, as you face it, are the shifts in generation in religious affiliation. So 18 to 29-year-old religious affiliation, 30 to 40, 49, 50 to 64, and 65 plus. And what we see is, first of all, the growth of the so-called nones. That big top purple thing is the people who claim no religious affiliation. Okay? If the younger generation is a leading indicator of the future, our future is a significant number of people who don't claim any religious affiliation. Right? You will see that as we get older, we're more religious. But that doesn't mean we become more religious as we get older. It just means us older people are more religious than our grandchildren. Okay? The other thing that would be useful, if you read from right to left, you see that little strip that is light yellow and orange, right? That's the strip that represents Judaism and all the other world religions. Everything that's green and blue is Christianity, right? Now read from right to left, and you'll see that that little strip of Jewish and other religions gets bigger. It begins at 1% among people my age. It's 4% among young people. So a leading indicator is that we are going to become in the future a nation with more people of non-Christian religions. And the only group that's not growing within that is Jewish. It's remaining relatively stable. But Muslim, and the major growth, by the way, is Muslims and Hindus. So Islam and Hinduism are growing religions in the U.S. at a time that Christianity is shrinking. Does that make sense? Okay. I also, though, because there's all this alarmist statistics flying around, I want you to notice that it's still pretty small, 4% total. Right? Whatever you read. You maybe live in a place where there's a lot more of any of these things, but overall in the U.S., not there. So, changing patterns of diversity. Non-Christian religious groups, with the exception of Jews, are growing slightly faster than the population overall. Okay? That is to say, they are a larger part of a smaller group of people who identify as religious. Okay? Because of the growth in non-Christian religious groups is still driven by larger family sizes among first and second generation immigrants, it's predicted to slow, and the Pew Charitable Trust and numerous other groups that do these demographics suggest that the non-Christian religious groups in the U.S. will max out at about 6% of the overall population in 2050. The biggest shift that will mean overall will be that Muslims will be a larger group than Jews, and therefore will be the single largest religious group after Christianity. Right? But the Muslim population, percentage-wise, will not even approach what the Christian population is. It'll be a minuscule portion of it. Okay? And geographic realities. Religious diversity is almost entirely concentrated in major urban areas, and it grows where urban areas are growing. So Houston is becoming more diverse. Greg can talk about that, because you're a growing area. But that said, we need to know this about our neighbors and friends that don't live in a major growing urban area. Because economics drives so much of migration, where economic opportunities exist, migrants who are not Christian go. And you would be very hard-pressed to find a town in Texas small enough that it does not have either a Hindu, Sikh, or Muslim doctor and a Buddhist Chinese restaurant owner. I always tell my students this: you find me a town with a Chinese restaurant and I'll find you a town with a Buddhist altar. Okay, you may say there are no Buddhists here. Well, I know one. He's opening the Grand Palace Buffet, right? And start looking at the names of the doctors that are registered in your local hospital in some place like Longview or Pittsburgh, or Texas and then see if you don't notice some names that come from the Indian subcontinent or from the Arab world. Okay? So in fact, although diversity is concentrated in urban areas, we shouldn't think it's non-existent everywhere. And that, for those of us that are Christian, provides both an opportunity and something we need to think about. I tell my students this: if you're pastoring a Christian church, or if you are the Jewish leader of a synagogue, and it may be Christian churches and synagogues are the only formal institutions in a Texas county seat town, you still have congregation members who are seeing a Muslim or a Hindu doctor. And for them, that can be an issue. Now, it may not be any issue at all, but I know it is for some because they come and talk to me, right? So religious diversity does play a role on these personal interaction levels. How do we feel about each other? This one, Greg?
What's that?
This feeling shift?
No.
No. Okay, good. So here's the deal. Americans feel warmer towards a variety of religious groups than we used to. Believe it or not, polls show that the chart on the left reads from left to right. We have warmer feelings about almost all the groups except evangelical Christians. Those of us who are not evangelical Christians feel about the same way about them that we did before. But believe it or not, those of us that aren't evangelical Christians feel much better about mainline Protestants, Jews. We even feel a lot better about Hindus and Muslims and those groups at the bottom. Now, that doesn't mean we have warm attitudes, right? You can see that our attitudes towards Muslims are at the bottom here, right? But maybe more telling is the chart on the right, in which what we see is that the spread of attitudes from positive to negative among people a little older than me and much older than me is pretty great. That is to say, strongly negative attitudes towards Muslims and atheists, strongly positive attitudes towards mainline Protestants and Jews. By the time you get to 18 to 29-year-olds, that demographic, what you find is it's compressed. Much better, much warmer attitudes towards the non-Christian religions and people who are different. However, much cooler attitudes towards Christianity. So there's a compression there, and that may be the future as well if this is a leading thing. So what does all this tell us? And this is my takeaway, then we'll do some Q&A. Times of both demographic change and changing attitudes demand greater attention to dialogue both within religious groups, so we don't lose touch generationally, right? Because we know we can see that happening just in our attitudes. If you bring the attitude of a typical 65-year-old American into conversation with the attitude of a typical 22-year-old American about non-Christian religions or about any religion, they're going to be different. If we're not talking to each other, then we're going to lose touch with each other and how we feel about religion. And the second thing is, we have to have a dialogue between different religious groups as we negotiate our shared social landscape. We're all in this together, right? And in some places, we're intensively in it together. And if we're not talking to each other, we're not going to be able to do much together. And that, let me give you one little interesting example of this. The deputy chairperson of the Tarrant County Republican Party is a Muslim. He was chosen by the head of the Tarrant County Republican Party to be his assistant. Well, Tarrant County's pretty conservative. It's Fort Worth. And so there's been a huge social media pushback. How can we possibly have a Muslim deputy chair of the county Republican Party? And so it turns out that Tarrant County Republicans are kind of divided on this issue. And they're having a big fight. Now, I'm not going to say which one's right or which wrong. I'm just saying the notable thing is the Republicans need to talk to each other about this. Right? They're split, and the split is generational. Right? So, and the younger generation is saying there's a lot of Muslims in Tarrant County. They might vote with us. The older generation is saying, mostly, not too sure. So we have to stay in dialogue with each other. We're going to have to work with each other, be in dialogue with each other. And I'm going to stop there and say let's take about 10, 15 minutes for some questions. I'm going to ask you to raise your hands to ask a question. I will acknowledge you, say your name, and state the question. I will observe that the term question means a single sentence followed by an interrogative. I'm inviting you to ask a question. I would prefer that you not give a lengthy dissertation, right? And then if you have lengthy dissertations that need to be delivered to me, I'm available in the break, as long as I have coffee and sugar. Yeah, go ahead. Stand and say it so I can hear it.
My name is Jim.
Yeah.
And my question goes back to the slide you just put up about.
The question is it possible that this compression among young people of attitudes is it related to the general lack of opinions generally about such things, as opposed to people who are older who have fixed opinions or at least have opinions about these kinds of things? And I will say one has to get into the weeds of the Pew report to see what this is saying, but that is a factor. As younger people care less about religion overall, it's easier to have both less negative views and fewer positive views. You know, so if you're ticking off a survey and you don't really care, what do you click? 5, right? That plays a role, but it's not the only role. And part of what the survey does, and we don't have time for it, is it breaks it down among religious young people and non-religious young people, right? Even religious young people, that is to say those who could be regarded as having formed opinions from their religious faith, have warmer views towards non-Christian religions. But they tend to have warmer views towards religion as well. So they compress from the top upward. Does that make sense? Okay. Another question. Okay, I'm going to go here, here, and here. So here.
My question relates to ports and diversity, and of course we understand like Port of Houston.
Right.
But in modern times,
So the question was, how does ports of entry, initially seaports and now airports, affect migration patterns in those places? With a second note, which actually has been in the news a bit, a reminder that the territory of Oregon was exclusive to white migration until it became a state and therefore fell under the federal Constitution. Although I think that people in Washington State would say that explains a lot about Oregonians. So I'll just, but let's take the port thing. It is actually the case that ports have always been the most diverse places in any part of the world, precisely because people migrate in and out of them, and there are always permanent settlements of traders, right? I believe that the rise of the large airports will make a difference. As you have more and more international airports, then migration is supported to those airports. An example of a port that's not really a port where there was huge migration is Chicago. But because it was deeply accessible by rail and canal, it had the characteristics of a seaport prior to the rise of modern air. Okay, so I think that's right. And of course, Houston, as it becomes the Port of Houston, is going to enjoy that. The DFW area, served by an international airport, then becomes a logical jumping off place. So, yeah, I think that's absolutely right. I'm going to go this way, and I see your hand back here, but let me start over here, okay? Yes?
Allowed, particularly with the upcoming conservative majority on the U.S. Supreme Court.
Right. So the question is, I'm repeating this for the camera. The question is, and everybody else, are U.S. attitudes and legal understandings of the way in which the federal government can be engaged in religion changing as we've had a changed Supreme Court and some rulings then that allow government funding at least to go towards religious organizations in a way that was previously thought not allowed? And will that continue to shift? I'll move back 2 steps and say if you really want to see where that shift begins, it's in the first Religious Freedom Restoration Act under the Clinton administration. And the fact that this takes place in a Democratic Congress and Democratic administration is an indication of a cultural shift at large and not merely a political division, right? And so that is beginning to happen. Now, What it will mean, I think, in the future is that there will be tests at the borders of where the federal government can be involved financially with religions, with religious institutions that provide a widespread public service. And if you want me to predict where the real test will be, it will be, can parents use federal funds to pay for a parochial school that does not allow non-Catholics, for example, right? So as long as the parochial school is essentially a non-sectarian school, then the current Supreme Court thinks there's no question, but we can see where it will bump up against exclusivity. I think it's a good question, and I'm hoping that this conference I do on religious freedom will have some experts that will tell us. But public attitudes are clearly changing, and let's just say honestly, those public attitudes are related to a longer-term shift beginning in the 1970s as Americans grow less excited about the power of central federal government and become more excited about state government and local government, right? So we've had a decline in big government interest, and that's affecting things. Now I'm going to go back here, and then I see you. So, yeah. Yeah, go ahead.
To be concerned about blacks in the rural South. That's my question.
Yeah. Okay, so the question is, the comment is that there was a Quaker woman named Auntie Jeeves who used her fortune to sponsor education of blacks in the rural South, and what inspired her, right? So the truth is I do know the name, but only recently, and I have a pretty good idea of what inspired her. In the Quaker community in Rhode Island and elsewhere, initially the Quakers were traders, and initially Quakers were slaveholders in the South. Okay, so in the period of the early 18th century, there were Quaker slaveholders. They weren't engaged in the slave trade. You may be interested to know that Jews were engaged in the slave trade rather heavily, but they were engaged in slaveholding. In the middle of the 18th century, a huge controversy arose, and it happens that one of my direct ancestors was engaged in it, a man named William Hunt, over the legitimacy of slavery. And William Hunt himself, as he traveled, he was a traveling Quaker evangelist, if you can imagine such a thing, but he began to refuse to stay with families that had slaves because he wouldn't have his horse groomed by a slave, right? Well, by the time of the American Revolution, the Quaker attitudes towards slavery, north to south, had changed completely. And the Quakers became ardent, across the board, ardent abolitionists. And so people like Auntie Jeeves, who had become wealthy, now become dedicated to the idea of the need for black Americans, especially the post-slavery era, to be educated. But it's interesting that it represents a real change in the religious thinking of the people of Quakers over the 18th century, and a real controversy, because many Quakers in the South were plantation owners. They were economically dependent on that system, right? Interestingly, it changed the demographics of the Quaker community, because when you could no longer make money in agriculture competitively, then you moved into the professions. And then Quakers become doctors and lawyers and things like this, and they move off the landed thing and become urban people. Is that?
My observation.
Yeah. Yeah, let me do one more question before the observation, okay? Yeah, because right over here.
Hi, atheists in the poll, or was that a separate category?
Okay, that's a good question. The poll on not associated with any religion, does it include atheists? And the answer is it does, okay? Yes, but they are a very, very small minority of those who don't associate with any religion. Most people would say maybe something like, I'm spiritual without being religious, or they just, no, they're really nones. But they're not atheists in the sense they're not denying the existence of God, right? So yeah, atheists remain a very small minority of the American population. Self-professed atheists remain a very small minority. Okay, here's a question, and then I'm going to get one more comment. Yeah?
Not mention the Shiite Muslim
Yeah.
community.
So the question is about the Sunni and Shiite Muslim communities growing. And the answer is that both are growing unevenly. The large growth in the Shiite Muslim community came after the 1979 revolution in Iran, in which large number of Shiite Muslims fled the Ayatollah. More recently, growth in the Shiite Muslim community has come with the Ismaili Muslims, but they are a very small fragment of even the Shiites. So they're growing, but the vast majority of the growth has been the Sunni community. And Sunnis make up 80% of the Muslim world, so it's not surprising. Okay. I think we do have time for one comment, and then we're going to take a break. But go ahead. And I'm going to repeat your words back to the mic. Yeah. Now, that's very helpful. I'm going to repeat that back, which is the observation that the term slave becomes an objectifying of people, and that if we can use the term people who were enslaved, we've put the emphasis back on their humanity and the condition in which they're having to live out their humanity. Does that get it? And by the way, there's one other term like that, and thank you for reminding me of this. I've used the term non-Christian, and of course this normalizes Christianity vis-a-vis the rest of society. So it's actually not a very desirable term. It's a sort of a quick one-off. Maybe Greg's got a suggestion, but we actually need an artful way of referring to all different religions in their subgroups without referencing them to one another. So when I was a Christian, as a member of a Christian minority in Malaysia, we didn't really care to be called non-Muslims, right? We didn't think of ourselves as not you. We thought of ourselves as ourselves. So those are terms that we do need to actually work on in our public discourse, so that we don't objectify and so that we don't define one person in relation to another.